now we want to look at, okay, well, we have the widening income gap. Well, what does that mean for wages and costs? So let's look at the Beige Book. So the Beige Book comes out, and it's just it's a good way for the Fed to show what do they see, how do they see it happening, well, what is the commentary. So the bespoke Beige Book index versus U.S. GDP growth. So the Beige Book continues to show the recovery, which, again, I'm not saying there isn't a recovery. I'm just saying what is going to be the extent of the recovery and the longevity of the recovery, because we're obviously going to get a spike. You don't give people all of this money, all of the stimulus measured in trillions, and it not show up, because the trillions is going to be in government spending, consumer spending. It's just consumer spending is shown to be, a flash in the pan. Government spending is going to be continuous, but again, the benefits of it will be difficult. So when we look at just what has happened with the Beige Book, the GDP is obviously going to go up. Quarter over quarter, we're going to see growth. Year over year, obviously we're going to see growth. Based on the base effect. It's just what is going to be the ability to continue this moving forward. And if the economy is really that good, why do we have so much stimulus still coming into the market? Not only on the monetary side, but also the fiscal side, which becomes a bigger question and leads to what happens with the velocity money, what happens because velocity money is just going to inherently increase inflation. So not only do you have the supply chain issues, but even if as those end, so say companies now feel comfortable, their supply chains are better, they go to invest more money. Well, they invest more money. What does that do? That increases the velocity money. The velocity money picks up. That's going to increase the amount of inflation as we start to see that. But again, these are things which is why we ended with the other chart looking at how did inflation start in the 60s into the 70s. It's not all at once. And that velocity of money, I think, is going to become that missing link to what happens next. And when we look at just the COVID concerns, so COVID is becoming less of a concern, obviously, especially in the U.S., it's where we're seeing cases remain steady. We're not, slightly increasing, but nothing exponential like in India. But the vaccine side, how many people are vaccinated? How many people want to get vaccinated? Where are the vaccinations happening? Are people going to travel abroad, stay local, move within states? So vaccines are going to become more of a conversation in terms of supply chain and speed of people getting inoculated. So then when we look at labor costs, so the survey, and this is coming from B of A, so the survey is of companies are more concerned about wage pressure than raw material costs, because right now we're seeing, again, the wage pressure. So wage pressures would be what happens when have your companies experienced higher labor or raw material costs? So they're starting to see more labor cost. And now, why is that the case? Well, how are you pulling people out of unemployment to try to meet some of these requirements, given that you're getting paid to stay home? So this is becoming a conflict where we keep talking about wage pressure coming in, but we're still not seeing it. And that's the caveat that we want to talk about, because we don't think we're wrong. It's a matter of being early, where you're starting to see some of this wage increases. You're trying to get people back in the office. You're trying to get people back, and you're compensating. So commodity prices are an issue, but labor is going to be the issue. The question is, how does this progress? And have your companies suggested that they anticipate higher costs over the next several months? If so, in what areas? So that you can see that they're starting to anticipate a little less labor. So they're experiencing a lot, but they anticipate less. And that's what we're talking about, that the anticipation and what we're seeing so far is going to cap some of this labor cost inflation, which will also mitigate some of the inflation side, because what is your biggest cost but employees and facilities. So again, this is going to be something to watch and weigh, because if we do get labor cost increases or wage inflation, then that's only going to set off even more inflation faster. And we're saying that, look, we think there's inflation, but wage inflation just isn't going to be there to the same extent. So that's where you're going to see some of the drawdown of savings and that slowdown in consumer spending on an aggregate level. Obviously not by, if we break it down by quintiles, the bottom three essentially won't be spending anytime soon. And this looks at it in a different way. So job openings are yielding fewer hires than expected. And we've talked about this using multiple different charts. Indeed did theirs, their economics team did their own. And the unemployment per opening versus hires per opening. So hiring gets more difficult when the labor market tightens, but after the summer of 2020, surge of recalls, aggregate job openings are resulting in fewer hires than the pre-pandemic relationship with tightness would suggest. So you're essentially pulling back furloughed people. So even though you have the job, you're rehiring who you let go. So the recalls are skewing some of the data. Now, what's causing hiring to come in lower than expected is the question that we continue to talk about. Is it the fear of COVID, childcare, because childcare still is difficult? Some schools are still remote or closed, unemployment benefits, or a combination of everything. And that's the thing that we continue to say is like, look, the job openings never collapsed, but the employment still remains a little soft. So we got that reopening push in the jobless numbers, in the new jobs data. We got that nice spike from seasonal moves. I went with my wife to Newport. Everything was open. There wasn't anything that was still closed. So seasonally, things are reopening. It's just at that reduced level. So again, getting back that next 50% of those that were let go is going to be difficult. And that's where we start to see that wage pressure. Because right now, you're the first, as we've said, just to break it down. So if you let go 100 people in March and April of 2020, our assumption was 20 to 30 people were going to be hired back within the next 2 to 3 months. Then by December, you were going to hire back the remainder 20 to 30. So you hired back 50% of who you let go. Now, through January and May, we assumed you were going to hire back another 20 to 30% along those seasonal levels, but not the remainder. And that's going to be where we start to see that pressure on wage increases that we keep talking about is on that back end. So then when we look at some of the additional pressures on cost, because we have to keep talking about semiconductors, here's the lead time. Now, the lead time can also be skewed because you're going to wait. So you're like, look, I'm just going to order it now because I'm not getting it anytime soon. So here you can see, and again, we had that tightness into 08, 19. We had a new foundry come on. The lead time came down. We were expected to be tight through 21 into 22 with new facilities coming on. But because of sanctions, because of pull-through, because now even sneakers at this point have semiconductors or microchips in them in some shape, way, or form, you're now seeing the lead times explode to highs. And the problem is this isn't going down because Taiwan has water issues. We've talked about water issues in places as far as the Ukraine, Crimea, Russia, to the issues in the Midwest. Again, these are things that are going to be an issue in general because you need a significant amount of water per wafer. But these supply disruptions or average lead time, they may not continue to get worse, but they're not going to get better. And that's, I think, the biggest issue when you look at supply chains in general. Now, while we look at wage inflation, what does it mean? We have to look at, okay, well, what is the real GDP expectation? So the April baseline after the stimulus that came through pushed us above what the pre-virus GDP path was supposed to be. But now the American jobs plan is supposed to layer on top of that. And how much stimulus when you look at overcapacity, because there's undercapacity, overcapacity, we're clearly above where we were supposed to be pre-COVID. So now we're dumping in all of this new money. Is it necessary? Or is it creating an unnecessary debt bubble that we don't need if you look at where we were on the 2020 baseline versus that April move? And again, these are things that, and even though the expectation of that obviously pushed us higher, but we also had reopenings. So we knew things were getting better in January, February, March, especially into March, but yet we pushed through the April moves anyway. And now we're talking about more stimulus. So how much of it is really necessary, one versus the other? And then when we look at Michigan house buying conditions versus GDP, so housing conditions are starting to get a little bit weaker looking out 6 quarters in advance, and that typically weighs on GDP year over year. Obviously, we're going to have that spike. But for those, when we look at 2020 GDP growth, the signals from the Michigan Consumer Survey are always a bit tough. House buying conditions are diving. They tend to do a good job at macro turns. So the thing is the ISM going to peak as well? So again, these are things to look at, trying to look forward. It's not perfect. You can see the divergence in 92. You can see a pretty big divergence in 07, 08. But typically, it's something where it's going to be indicative of where do we marry. Like, they don't have to be perfect, but the trend is going to be there. And again, that's going to cap some of that GDP growth because there's a housing shortage, there's a rise in costs, and people just don't have the savings. So, or those that are left, because when we look at who has purchased before, 760 or better on a credit score, which is obviously top rating. These are the types of things that are going to start to weigh as we look at who is going to be the next buyer. And as prices go up, can that next incremental buyer afford the new price, as we're now at about 104% to 106% on average in the US of asking price. So then when we turn to, okay, well, let's look at University of Michigan's consumer sentiment. April University sentiment missed expectations, but still up to 86.5 versus 89. And 84.9 in prior months. So, getting there, current conditions at 97.2 versus 93 prior. Expectations are unchanged at 79.7, but inflation expectations continue to go up. So again, we're still kind of leveling off at these levels at this point, because there's that conflict of, can I get a job? What's happening with savings? I'm seeing my cost go up. Is that going to, and that's slowing down some of the way people feel about the market in general. And this just puts it into context on present conditions. We're still not back to where we were pre-COVID. We're closing some of that gap, but the biggest issue is consumer expectations, which you can see leveling off, because expectations are starting to get weighed down based on what we're seeing at the pump, at the store. Again, these are things that are going to be big issues when we look at the consumer. And U.S. consumer-based inflation expectations have mitigated a bit for the next 5 years, still at the highs, but for the 1 year continue to drive higher because we continue to see it getting delivered. P&G is just another example, which we'll quote in a few minutes. And that's why we continue to be concerned about where is this going to go on the inflation side. Now, when we look at the record monthly debt issuance in March, which put pressure on just where the U.S. was in terms of just the amount of debt coming to the market, this is going to be the prolonged issue. When you look at the Treasury, federal agencies, when you look at just what the Treasury is doing and how it's going to persist over the next few months, years at this level. And that's why we continue to be concerned about what does that total look like as we progress, and what is that going to do to rates overall as rates continue to come under pressure. With obviously, the 20-year came in a bit stronger, but it was stronger in ways and weaker in others. So we keep getting these mixed bond auctions, which again is just showing to some of this conflicting data and these different points of view. Now, composite PMI, when we look at where PMI is, and then the Q3 GDP consensus. So there's going to be, again, this kind of marriage of where do we see this shake out? And GDP is going to be strong. It's just, what does this mean going forward on that 1 year look ahead? And the PMI is obviously there, supply side, but are we going to see some of this weighing us down a bit in terms of what comes next? So then when we look and provide an update on some of the home-based data, so small business employment continues to recover, and we had it coming into the seasonal norm. The seasonal reopening, which is again coming into Easter. You have some of the summer spots starting to get more active, and here we think at this point, when we look at what employees have done, and this is the change to July of 2020, to look at the seasonal moves. What is that seasonal norm? And that's why we think, just based on what we've seen, we're going to hang right around this baseline, because July was pretty good. People felt better about their situation. COVID was falling. You had some of this reopening. People wanted to be outside. So I think we're going to get something similar. It should, maybe it gets a little bit better. You can see how we had some strong movements through Labor Day, and then obviously it fell off for the holidays. Then we had the COVID resurgence. So I just think that we're going to see something similar to what we had on that 7-day moving average leading into Labor Day. But getting past that's going to be that difficult point, which we just don't see. Now, on the other side, when we look at relationships with management are critical in employee life satisfaction, this is where, do we go back to the office? Do we not go back to the office? Work from home versus flex schedule. A lot of individuals are concerned about maintaining their status with management, getting that face time. And I think we're starting to see a bit more of leniency on that. But again, this is why I agree with this. I think this speaks more to flex schedule versus work from home. And that's something that is going to take time to develop. What is it 1 day at home, 2 days at home? Does it work? And I think we're going to get a testing period, which again is going to weigh on what does that reopening of the corporate world look like that is really supposed to accelerate in September, October, November. Because this is a big component to job satisfaction. Because if management knows you, if they think you're doing a good job, your chance of bonus advancement increases, and you know how much of that can you do via Zoom or something like we're doing right now. But we do have the types of jobs changing. So when we look at what are jobs doing, AI-related jobs in the data side by country and year, you can see the acceleration in the U.S., and China's trying to close this gap, but the U.S. is continuously being the driving force. Now, this is through 2018. We know it's accelerated in China. We know it's been strong in the U.S. This is going to be a growth point. But to do AI work, do I need to be? Am I doing code? If I'm doing code, my final product is going to be, did I do a good job? Can I code at home, or do I have to be in an office? Or if I'm building AI equipment, is that manufacturing? And these are going to be these weights on what are those job postings, and it's also going to drive how are people going to school and for what, which is where we look at the employment side on PhDs and just in general academia industry. The industry side continues to attract more activity because there's a lot of returns still to be made on the AI side. So employment of new AI PhDs to academia or industry. When we look into the industry, we've had some growth where people are leaving academia and trying to apply what they've learned into the industry side and driving some of that up in general. So we're seeing some of these shifts, some of these changes on the job front. Now, when we take that from the job side and we look into, okay, well, where are we from here on how are people consuming? What does that consumption look like? We had Netflix, it just makes me think of it when I think of the AI or the algorithm that Netflix uses to figure out what you want to watch. Okay, well, Netflix had a big miss. But what does that mean? Like the share of Americans who receive TV, you can see that from 2015 to 2021, we've had cord cutting, have a subscription, did not have a subscription in the past versus cable. Access what they want on the content now at bottom left, non-subscribers cite the availability of content online and costs as reasons they do not subscribe to cable and satellite. So 71% say they can access the content they want to watch online. The cost of cable and satellite service is too expensive, or 45% saying they don't watch enough television. Now, when we break it down by age bracket, 61% ages 18 to 29 had not subscribed before to cable or satellite at home. They say 91% say they can access the content they want to watch online. The cost of cable is too much, is not so much a younger, but as you get into 50 plus, you're saying that it is. The issue that we've had now, and we're starting to see this with price increases, like Netflix has pushed through a price increase, Disney Plus. Now you're starting to get a lot of these extra assets. And we've had friends, this is the anecdotal now. Anecdotal side, I've had friends that have cut the cord, and after they assembled everything, and this usually happens once they have kids, once they added PBS and Disney Plus and PBS, what are some of the others? Highlights and other types of things that get added on Nickelodeon. All of a sudden, you're now paying more than if you just had cable, because cable also gives you the access to log into Nickelodeon and PBS and Disney Now and all of these other aspects. So you get the best of both worlds. I think that is starting to become more of the norm, because I mean, when I set up this office, it was $5 extra to get a cable hookup. Now, my main cost is internet, and internet is remaining expensive. Broadband is expensive. So as costs go up on the internet side, is it going to make sense to get some of this and start to weigh? Do you start to get some of these benefits? And again, this is why I think we're coming to a saturation point where some people are going to come back a bit to cable because the pendulum has swung, but you're still going to get people that are like, look, I still don't watch enough TV. I'd rather pay for ESPN Plus or ESPN Go than buy cable and get ESPN. So again, these are things to look for. Now, on the spending side, following through on the spending, we had the bump, the stimulus, the stimmy going out into the world, and now we're already seeing a drop off. And this is what we keep talking about with credit card sales. People pre-spent their money. It didn't go as far because of price increases, and now it's quickly starting to drop off. And when we look at the retail sales, obviously you could see it. Like the credit card data is just mirroring the stimulus payments when they were spent. They were spent, and now they're coming over. So they're rolling over, and that's why we think that retail sales are going to start to disappoint to the downside as we see some of the slowdown in just general spending. So the debit and credit card spending is also different. The UK is not spending the same way the US is. Again, this is speaking to the UK was still in lockdown. They have some work to do. They can catch up. They will catch up. But they also did see the same type of stimulus the US did, speaking to what drove that delta. Then, obviously, when we look at retail sales in general, back to life in March, you had some explosions in general, just in terms of just the amount that was being spent. Again, this is stimulus. This is a lot of, some of that pent up reopening, which did happen in March. You had the biggest acceleration of vaccinations, people moving about more. So again, this is not surprising. It's just something that we think is going to pare back, especially when we look against February, which was impacted by the freeze off. Then when we look at just general U.S. retail sales changing, this is total core. You can see just where the benefits are in general on the shifts back to some sort of normalcy. It's just now that we have the stimulus that has been pushed through, that'll start to abate, and we'll start to get some of those declines that we've seen in previous on month over month. Year over year will remain strong given the softness in the base effect. But again, what is this going to look like on the go forward, and how is the consumer going to react given that prices are going up? We continue to see some of these costs, and that's going to limit the amount people can really spend in general when we look at the C, or the consumer, in that GDP calculation, not just through 2021, but what do we look like in 2022 and beyond?